March 21st, 1918, 4:23 hours. Villers-Bretonneux, France. Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, 24 years old, crouches in a forward trench that smells of mud, blood, and the peculiar sweetness of poison gas residue. His standard Luger P08 pistol feels inadequate in his trembling hands. Across 40 meters of cratered no-man's land, he can hear them. British soldiers manning a forward observation post, their Lee Enfield rifles capable of cutting down any German soldier foolish enough to show his head above the parapet. The standard 8-round magazine in his Luger might as well be empty before he starts. He's watched 11 men from his company die in the past 3 days trying to take this sector. Machine gun nests run out of ammunition at critical moments. Rifle fire can't suppress multiple positions simultaneously. The British have turned this stretch of the Western Front into a killing ground that swallows Germans whole. Hartmann's Feldwebel crawls up beside him, carrying a wooden crate stamped with Gothic letters. P08 Trommelmagazin 08, artillery model, vertraulich, confidential. Inside is a device that looks wrong attached to his pistol, a massive snail-shaped drum, grotesquely oversized for a sidearm, holding 32 9mm parabellum rounds where 8 should be. "Load this," the Feldwebel whispered. "The Stormtroopers call it the Höllentrommel, hell drum." Hartmann has no idea what he's holding. He only knows that in 7 minutes, when the barrage lifts, he'll find out if this strange magazine can do what conventional pistols couldn't, give one man the suppressive firepower of an entire squad. The Great War had created a problem that nobody in the German military had anticipated when they adopted the Parabellum Pistole Model 1908. Georg Luger's famous pistol was engineered to be an officer's sidearm and a cavalry weapon. Elegant, accurate, and reliable with its 8-round detachable magazine, but utterly inadequate for the new warfare that emerged from the trenches. By late 1916, German forces had encountered a nightmare scenario repeated across the Somme, Verdun, and Ypres. Trench warfare had created situations where small assault teams, the newly formed Stoßtruppen or stormtroopers, needed overwhelming short-range firepower to clear enemy trenches before defenders could react. The standard infantry weapons, the Gewehr 98 rifle and the MG08 machine gun, were too long, too heavy, or too cumbersome for the tight confines of trench warfare. The Luger pistol offered maneuverability and one-handed operation that rifles couldn't match, but 8 rounds disappeared in seconds during close-quarters fighting. Intelligence reports from the Battle of the Somme in July 1916 documented Stoßtroopers emptying their Lugers into the first enemy position, then being forced to draw trench knives or clubs for subsequent encounters. The casualty rates were horrific. Captain Hugo Schmeisser at the Theodor Bergmann Weapons Factory in Suhl had been working on a solution since early 1916, but the engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. Standard pistol magazines used simple spring pressure to feed cartridges upward, but a spring strong enough to feed 32 rounds reliably would be too stiff to compress by hand. And a straight magazine, 32 rounds long, would extend nearly 18 inches below the pistol grip, making the weapon impossibly awkward. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a naval artillery mechanism. Engineers at the Rheinische Metallwaren und Maschinenfabrik in Düsseldorf had developed a spiral feed system for anti-aircraft cannons that stored ammunition in a rotating drum. Tatarek Friedrich von Tatarek, a designer at the company, realized the principle could be miniaturized for small arms. The resulting device, officially designated the Trommelmagazin 08, or Snail Drum Magazine 08, represented a radical departure from conventional magazine design. Instead of stacking cartridges in a vertical column, the drum arranged them in a continuous spiral that rotated as rounds fed into the weapon. The geometry was elegant. 32 cartridges occupied roughly the same vertical space as 12 rounds in a conventional magazine. Development accelerated through late 1916. The first functional prototype emerged in December, tested at the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds outside Berlin. Initial results were promising but problematic. The drum fed reliably at slow rates of fire, but jammed when operators fired rapidly, the spring torque insufficient to keep pace with the Luger's toggle lock mechanism cycling at maximum speed. Engineers reinforced the mainspring, going through 17 iterations before achieving reliable feeding at cyclic rates approaching 150 rounds per minute, far faster than any human could actually pull the trigger, but providing a safety margin for combat conditions. The final spring design used music wire, precisely heat-treated to achieve the correct balance between strength and flexibility. By February 1917, production began at RWS facilities in Nuremberg. Security classification marked each drum vertraulich, confidential, though not the highest secrecy level. The German High Command wanted the drums distributed quickly to stormtrooper units, but didn't want intelligence about the new magazine reaching Allied forces before combat deployment. The first shipments arrived at the Western Front in March 1917, distributed to designated Stoßtrupp battalions preparing for spring offensives. Each drum came with a loading tool, a specialized wrench that compressed the mainspring while soldiers fed cartridges into the spiral track. Loading 32 rounds took approximately 90 seconds with the tool, compared to 5 seconds for an 8-round box magazine, but the firepower increase justified the time investment. The Trommelmagazin 08 transformed the Luger from an officer's sidearm into something approaching a submachine gun, not quite achieving the sustained firepower of a true automatic weapon, but offering unprecedented ammunition capacity in a package small enough for trench fighting. A soldier with a drum-fed Luger could engage 4 times as many targets as his counterpart with a standard magazine before reloading. Field testing revealed immediate tactical applications. Stormtroopers used drum-fed Lugers as point weapons during trench assaults, suppressing enemy positions while teammates maneuvered. The sustained fire capability allowed single soldiers to keep British or French defenders pinned down for the critical seconds needed to close distance and clear positions with grenades or flamethrowers. But the drums had limitations that would become apparent only in combat. The loading complexity meant soldiers couldn't reload quickly under fire. The weight, nearly 3 pounds when fully loaded, made the Luger front-heavy and difficult to aim accurately in sustained firefights. And the mechanical complexity introduced failure modes that simple box magazines never experienced. If you want to see how this ungainly magazine transformed close-quarters combat on the Western Front and why soldiers both loved and cursed the Höllentrommel in equal measure, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. This story gets even more intense, and you won't want to miss the moment these drums first made contact with British trenches during Operation Michael, Germany's last great offensive of the war. Back to Lieutenant Hartmann and that oversized drum magazine. The Trommelmagazin 08 looked like something grafted onto the Luger from a different weapon entirely, and for good reason. It wasn't designed for the Luger at all, at least not initially. Friedrich von Toterek's original concept had been for the Parabellum MG-14, an aircraft-mounted machine gun variant that used the same toggle lock mechanism as the pistol, but fired from an open bolt at 700 rounds per minute. The Snail drum magazine solved the problem of providing sufficient ammunition for aerial combat without the weight penalty of belt-fed systems. When adapted for the P08 pistol, the drum measured 5.9 inches in diameter and 1.6 inches thick, constructed from stamped steel with a sheet metal cover. The total weight empty was 1.2 pounds. Loaded with 32 rounds of 9 by 19 mm parabellum ammunition, it reached 2.8 pounds. For comparison, the Luger pistol itself weighed only 1.9 pounds empty. This meant a drum-fed Luger weighed 4.7 pounds loaded, compared to 2.3 pounds with a standard 8-round magazine. The center of balance shifted dramatically forward, turning the elegantly balanced pistol into a front-heavy implement that required two-handed control for accurate fire. The internal mechanism represented the revolutionary element. 32 cartridges arranged in a spiral pattern around a central hub, each round positioned at a slight angle to its neighbor. As the topmost cartridge fed into the weapon, a coiled mainspring provided rotational force to advance the next round into position. The spring itself was a masterpiece of precision manufacturing. Constructed from 0.8 mm music wire, it provided approximately 12 pounds of rotational force when fully wound, but decreased to 3 pounds as the drum emptied. Engineers calculated this digressive spring rate carefully. Too much force and early rounds would feed too aggressively, potentially causing double feeds or damaging the Luger's feed mechanism. Too little force and the final rounds wouldn't feed reliably. The spiral track inside the drum used carefully calculated geometry. Each cartridge occupied a channel precisely 9.2 millimeters wide and 19.7 millimeters long, with tolerances held to within 0.1 millimeter. The spiral advanced through 720 degrees, making exactly 2 complete rotations from first round to last. This geometry was critical. A steeper spiral would bind as the spring relaxed, while a shallower spiral would require a larger drum. Loading required the specialized tool, designated Trommelmagazin Füllwerkzeug. The device consisted of a ratcheting handle that engaged slots in the drum's central hub, compressing the mainspring while the operator inserted cartridges into the spiral track. Loading direction mattered. Cartridges had to be inserted following the spiral's rotation, and each round needed to be fully seated before the next could be inserted. Field manuals issued to units receiving the drums specified detailed loading procedures. First, engage the loading tool and compress the spring 5 full rotations. Insert the first cartridge at 12 o'clock, brass rim fully seated in the retention groove. Rotate the loading tool counterclockwise 1/8 turn. Insert the second cartridge. Repeat until all 32 rounds are loaded. Disengage the loading tool slowly, allowing the spring to tension against the cartridge stack. The process took trained soldiers approximately 90 seconds. Untrained soldiers could take 3 minutes or more, and mistakes were common. Loading cartridges in the wrong direction, failing to fully seat rounds, or allowing the spring to unwind prematurely, all resulted in jams that required complete disassembly to clear. The drum attached to the Luger through the same magazine well that accepted standard 8-round magazines, but required an adapter piece called the Trommelmagazin halter. This aluminum casting extended the magazine well downward and provided a more secure seating surface for the drum's greater weight. The adapter added another 0.3 pounds and changed the Luger's grip angle slightly, affecting point shooting accuracy. Reliability varied dramatically based on conditions. In clean, dry environments, properly loaded drums fed with 95% reliability, acceptable for combat weapons. But trench warfare provided anything but clean, dry environments. Mud infiltrating the spiral track could cause feeding failures. Temperature extremes affected spring tension. Drums stored in cold weather became sluggish as lubricants thickened, while excessive heat could over-tension springs, causing double feeds. Testing at Kummersdorf documented these failure modes through rigorous environmental trials. Drums submerged in muddy water for 2 hours showed 47% failure rates. Drums exposed to temperatures below -10 Celsius experienced 31% failure rates. Drums subjected to repeated drops from 4 feet height, simulating combat handling, showed 23% failure rates after 10 drops. These statistics influenced deployment doctrine. Field regulations specified that drums should be carried in leather pouches that protected them from mud and impact. Soldiers were instructed to load drums in covered positions, not exposed trenches where contamination was likely. And critically, stormtroopers were advised to carry at least one standard 8-round magazine as backup in case their drum jammed. The 9x19mm parabellum ammunition itself required consideration. Standard German military loads used a 124-grain full metal jacket bullet at approximately 1,150 feet per second muzzle velocity. This generated chamber pressures around 35,000 psi, well within the Luger's design limits for occasional firing. But sustained rapid fire from a 32-round drum generated heat that the Luger wasn't designed to handle. The P08's toggle lock mechanism, elegant and reliable in normal use, became problematic when firing extended strings. The toggle joint, 2 links connected by a pin, absorbed recoil energy by breaking upward and rearward. This mechanical advantage worked perfectly for cooling periods between shots, but generated significant heat at the pivot pin during rapid fire. Temperature measurements during testing showed the toggle pin could reach 180 degrees Fahrenheit after firing 20 rounds in rapid succession. At these temperatures, lubricants broke down, and metal expansion affected tolerances. Guns that functioned perfectly when cool would experience stoppages after sustained firing, the toggle failing to fully close or extract. Field manuals addressed this limitation directly. The Trommelmagazin 08 provides increased ammunition capacity, but does not transform the Luger into a machine gun. Sustained rapid fire will cause overheating and potential weapon failure. Fire in controlled bursts of 5 to 7 rounds with brief cooling intervals. This guidance often proved impossible to follow in combat. Soldiers engaged in close-quarters trench fighting didn't have the luxury of counting rounds or pausing for cooling intervals. They fired until enemies stopped advancing or the weapons stopped functioning, whichever came first. The drums saw their first major combat deployment during the Battle of Arras in April 1917. German stormtrooper units defending against British and Canadian attacks used drum-fed Lugers as close defense weapons when enemy forces penetrated their trench lines. After-action reports documented mixed results. Oberlieutenant Werner Steinmetz, commanding a Stoßtrupp platoon near Vimy Ridge, filed a report that captured the drum's dual nature. The Trommelmagazin 08 provided critical firepower when Canadian infantry broke into our communications trench. One soldier with a drum-fed Luger held a traverse point for approximately 40 seconds, firing 27 rounds that allowed our squad to reorganize and counterattack. However, 2 drums jammed during the engagement, one from mud infiltration, one from apparent spring failure. Recommend continued deployment, but increased training on emergency clearing procedures. By summer 1917, approximately 180,000 Trommelmagazin 08 drums had been manufactured and distributed to Western Front units. Production accelerated through the fall, reaching a peak output of 35,000 drums per month in November 1917, as Germany prepared for what would become the Spring Offensive of 1918. The drums found unexpected secondary applications. Machine gun crews adopted them for MG-08-15 light machine guns, which could accept the drums through adapter mechanisms. Aircraft armorers loaded them for aerial combat, though the weight became problematic in weight-sensitive aircraft applications. Even artillery crews began carrying drum-fed Lugers for close defense of gun positions during gas attacks or infiltration raids. The British captured their first intact Trommelmagazin in May 1917 during the Battle of Messines. Intelligence analysts at the British Expeditionary Force headquarters examined the device with fascination and alarm. A report dated May 28, 1917 noted, "The German Snail drum magazine represents a significant tactical development. It provides pistol-armed personnel with firepower approaching that of rifle-armed troops in close quarters. Recommend development of equivalent British systems for evaluation." This recommendation led to limited British experimentation with high-capacity magazines for the Webley revolver and various semi-automatic pistols, but nothing reached production before the armistice. The British military establishment remained skeptical of pistols as primary combat weapons, viewing them as secondary arms for officers and specialists. The French captured examples during the Nivelle offensive and conducted their own analysis. French ordnance officers noted the mechanical sophistication but questioned the reliability in field conditions. A report from the Section Technique de l'Artillerie dated June 1917 concluded, "The German drum magazine demonstrates advanced engineering but introduces complexity inappropriate for combat weapons. Spiral feed mechanisms are inherently vulnerable to contamination and damage. Recommend observation but not replication." The American Expeditionary Forces, arriving in France through 1917 and early 1918, encountered drum-fed Lugers during training with Allied forces. American ordnance officers showed greater interest, recognizing potential applications for the trench warfare they anticipated. However, American entry into the war came too late to develop domestic equivalents before the conflict ended. Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, crouching in that forward trench near Villers-Bretonneux on March 21, 1918, represented the culmination of 2 years of doctrinal development and tactical evolution. The Trommelmagazin 08 attached to his Luger had been manufactured in January 1918, loaded 3 days ago by a supply sergeant who'd done the job hundreds of times. 4.27 hours. 3 minutes until the barrage lifts. Hartmann checks the drum's seating, feeling it lock solidly into the magazine well adapter. The weight pulls the muzzle down. He's practiced this. Hours on the range learning to compensate for the altered balance. His hands have stopped shaking. Around him, 8 other stormtroopers crouch with similar loads. 4 carry drum-fed Lugers. 2 have the new MP-18 submachine guns, revolutionary weapons that would define the next war. 2 more carry flamethrowers, terrifying weapons that required courage Hartmann couldn't imagine. The British know they're coming. The preliminary bombardment has been going for 5 hours, thousands of artillery shells screaming overhead. But bombardments don't win battles. Infantry wins battles. Men who close with the enemy and force them from their positions through shock, violence, and overwhelming firepower at point-blank range. 4.29 hours. 1 minute. Hartmann's breathing slows. 2 years of war have either killed you or taught you to function through fear. He survived this long by being smart, being careful, and trusting his equipment. The Luger has never failed him. The drum is untested, at least by him, but thousands of other soldiers have used them. He has to believe it will work. The artillery barrage reaches crescendo, shells impacting every 2 seconds, the ground shaking continuously. The British trenches ahead disappear in eruptions of mud and smoke. Somewhere in that maelstrom, enemy soldiers huddle in dugouts and shelters, waiting for the barrage to lift, knowing what comes next. 4.30 hours. The artillery shifts. Suddenly, dramatically, the shells begin falling 200 meters deeper, targeting British support trenches and command posts. The silence in the immediate front seems deafening after 5 hours of bombardment, though distant guns continue their thunder. "Vorwärts!" the Feldwebel screams. "Forward!" Hartmann climbs over the parapet, the drum-fed Luger held in both hands, muzzle oriented toward the British line. 8 other men rise with him. Behind them 200 more stormtroopers emerge from assault trenches, moving in small groups, exploiting craters and dead ground. The distance closes. 40 meters becomes 30. Still no fire from the British position. The bombardment has done its job, stunning the defenders, destroying communications, creating the crucial window of shock that stormtrooper tactics exploit. 20 meters, Hartmann can see the British trench line now, shattered sandbags and collapsed parapets. Movement, a British soldier rising from a shelter, Lee Enfield rifle swinging toward the advancing Germans. Hartmann fires. The Luger cycles with its familiar toggle action, brass ejecting to the right, but unlike the standard magazine where 8 rounds disappear almost before you realize you're shooting, the drum keeps feeding. He fires again and again. The British soldier drops. More defenders appear, a Lewis gun team scrambling to man their weapon. Hartmann shifts fire, squeezing off 5 rapid shots at 15 meters. The Lewis gunner falls, his assistant dives for cover. The drum continues feeding. Hartmann fires and fires and fires. 12 rounds, 15, 20. The sustained barrage keeps multiple British positions suppressed while his squadmates maneuver closer. A German stormtrooper with an MP-18 reaches the British parapet and pours fire into the trench. The newer weapon fires faster, a continuous rattle of 9mm rounds, but Hartmann's Luger delivers the same ammunition with greater accuracy, each shot placed deliberately rather than sprayed. 25 rounds fired. The Luger is heating up. Hartmann can feel it through his gloves. 7 rounds remaining in the drum. He fires 4 more shots at a British soldier attempting to man a traversed firing position, then pauses. 3 rounds left. The British position ahead is neutralized. 4 enemy soldiers down, 3 more retreating deeper into their trench system. Hartmann's squad controls the first trench line. But the weapon in his hands has become problematic. The toggle is sluggish, heat affecting its operation. When he fires the 30th round, the empty case fails to eject cleanly, sticking in the ejection port. Stoppage. Training takes over. Tap the magazine to ensure seating. Rack the toggle to clear the chamber. The stuck case pops free. The 30th round chambers, but the toggle doesn't fully close. Hartmann taps it with his palm, feeling it lock forward. He fires. The round discharges, but the toggle barely cycles, failing to chamber the 31st round. The drum is done. Either the heat has disabled the weapon, or the spring has weakened, or some failure mode has occurred. Hartmann doesn't know and doesn't have time to diagnose it. He drops the drum magazine, the heavy steel drum clattering against the duckboards, and pulls a standard 8-round magazine from his pouch. The familiar magazine clicks home. The Luger suddenly feels properly balanced again, responsive. He chambers a round and continues forward. The first British trench line has fallen. Behind Hartmann, the main German assault wave is consolidating. Ahead, the British are organizing resistance at their second line. The battle continues. But for 90 seconds, that ungainly drum magazine had given one German lieutenant the firepower to suppress multiple enemy positions simultaneously, covering his squad's advance across the most dangerous ground in warfare, the final 20 meters before contact. That's what the Trommelmagazin 08 provided. Not perfection, not reliability, but capability that didn't exist before, purchased at the price of complexity, weight, and eventual failure. For those 90 seconds, it had been enough. The spring offensive of 1918, Operation Michael, represented Germany's last major attempt to break the stalemate on the Western Front before American forces arrived in decisive numbers. The attack launched on March 21, 1918, along a 50-mile front, employing 6,608 artillery pieces and 76 divisions of infantry. Stormtrooper units spearheaded the assault, equipped with the best weapons Germany could provide. Drum-fed Lugers featured prominently in assault loadouts, with estimates suggesting approximately 40,000 drums were distributed to attacking units in the weeks before the offensive. The attack achieved stunning initial success. German forces advanced up to 40 miles in some sectors, the deepest penetration of Allied lines since 1914. Stormtrooper tactics emphasizing infiltration and exploitation rather than linear advances caught British defenders unprepared. Drum-fed Lugers proved their worth during the initial assault phase. After-action reports documented numerous instances where small stormtrooper teams used the sustained firepower to suppress British positions while maneuvering for grenade assaults or flamethrower attacks. The drums excelled in the role they'd been designed for, providing brief but overwhelming fire superiority at close range. But success created its own problems. As German forces advanced beyond their artillery support and supply lines stretched, the drums' limitations became apparent. Units couldn't resupply the specialized drums as easily as standard ammunition. The loading time became problematic when fighting developed into sustained engagements rather than quick assaults. Hauptmann Friedrich Zehner, commanding a stormtrooper company during the advance toward Amiens, filed a report on March 28 describing the issue. Initial assault phase, Trommelmagazin performance excellent. Sustained operations beyond day 3, magazine failures increased significantly due to mud, impact damage, and lack of proper maintenance facilities. Recommend future operations include adequate drum reserves and specialized maintenance personnel. The mechanical complexity that made the drums function also made them vulnerable. A standard box magazine, damaged or dirty, might still feed adequately. A drum magazine with contaminated spiral tracks or weakened springs simply stopped working, and field repairs were nearly impossible. The precision required to service the internal mechanism exceeded what unit armorers could provide with available tools. Casualty rates among drum-armed stormtroopers showed interesting patterns. During the initial 72 hours of Operation Michael, stormtroopers with drum-fed Lugers suffered 18% lower casualties than those with standard magazines, likely reflecting the drum's suppressive fire advantage during assaults. But after day 4, casualty rates equalized as drums failed and soldiers reverted to standard magazines or captured weapons. British forces adapted quickly. Intelligence bulletins distributed to frontline units by March 25 warned of German drum magazines and advised exploiting their vulnerabilities. The enemy's drum magazine requires considerable time to reload and appears prone to mechanical failure. When engaged by drum-armed attackers, seek cover and return sustained fire. The enemy's high-capacity magazine provides no advantage once exhausted if he cannot reload quickly. French intelligence reached similar conclusions. A report from the Deuxième Bureau dated April 2, 1918, analyzed captured drums and concluded the German drum magazine represents an attempt to compensate for inadequate submachine gun development. It provides temporary firepower advantage but cannot be sustained. Recommend stockpiling captured examples for technical study but discouraging field adoption.